Well, hello and good evening, and welcome to our development stream for November 2020 on Friday the 13th. I mean, why not? And as a quick note, this month is actually our second year on Patreon, and we didn't even set anything special up, but who knows, we might still come up with something until the end of the month. Anyhow, our patrons have voted for a new plugin of the month, and it's going to be a PBR Texture Set node. The idea is that as opposed to using individual image nodes to set up your PBR-based surfaces and shading, you will be able to use a single node to manage all your textures. And yes, we have already started developing a little bit, so I'll just show you the current state. I'm going to add a super simple sphere primitive to the scene. Just move the camera a bit closer, and if I start rendering it in VPR, you'll see it's just, a white sphere. And let's see if I can just move it over here so I can just keep it rendering on this side. All right. So, and that gives us a surface that's called default. I'm going to the node editor, and let's see if I can shrink this down a little. There we go. Actually, let's just change the preset here to something like that. All right. So, we basically have our principal BSDF shader or material here that's being rendered, and there's nothing applied to it. So first thing I do is I add the 2D Textures PBR Texture Set. That is the new node for this month. Double click on it, and you will already see the user interface on the right-hand side. This looks a bit overwhelming at first. It's actually very tall. But I'll just show you the simple use, and then we'll just go through the individual settings and what they do. So I'm going to load textures. And let's see what I have. I've got this directory called PBR that contains some PBR sets. And I've got one called metal plates. And you can see there's 5 textures in here. It's the color, the displacement, the metalness, the normal, and the roughness. So I'll just select all of those, open them. And you will see these textures have been loaded into Lightwave. They're in the image editor now. And they are assigned to different slots here. So we have a color slot, a metallic slot, roughness, occlusion, luminous, normal, and displace. These are essentially the standard texture slots that you have in a metallic PBR texture set. And I've loaded all of these at once, and it assigned them to the proper slots depending or based on their names. In the node itself, I have a color output, luma and alpha, which is just the luma and the alpha of the color image, if there is one. I have metallic roughness, specular glossiness, more on those two a bit later. Occlusion, luminous color, displacement, normal, and bump. So all I have to do now is just connect them. So I connect the color to the color, I connect the roughness to the roughness, I connect the metallic to the metallic. I can even hook up the bump. And is there one that I have missed? No, that's it. And, essentially this is my PBR setup. No, PBR texture setup for the maps that I've just selected. And the interesting thing is that you can just load a whole different set of maps in here and get a completely different look. So let's see if that works. Just go to configure, turn on clear before loading. And this is actually, let me just clear all the textures. Yes. Okay, now they're all gone. I'm going to load a different texture set this time. Let's use the wood, which is just 4 textures. And they're being loaded and assigned, and I've got them applied to my mesh. Now, the interesting thing is I don't actually have any projection assigned to the whole thing. It's using the default coordinates, or if there's a UV map on the mesh, it's using the default UVs on the mesh automatically. And if you want to change the projection, you can input a projection node into the PBR Texture Set node here. One thing that we're still planning to add is triplanar mapping within the node, and that's going to be an option here in the mapping tab. And one more thing that's going to be added is a big presets button, so you can load and save whole texture sets as presets. So you just need to set up your PBR textures once, save them as a preset, and then you can just reuse them in different places. All right, so what do we have here? We have the load texture sets option here. That's a pop-up menu. It allows you to load textures just like I did right now. You basically multi-select the textures that you want, and it assigns them to the correct slots depending on the name. You can clear all the textures, which just removes them from the user interface, not from layout itself. So if I go to the image editor right now, you will notice that the original ones that are loaded at the start are still there, as they should be. So it doesn't delete anything. So you can clear all textures, you can configure the whole thing, and that gives you the option to enable clear before loading. Because if I load textures now, then it's actually not going to overwrite texture slots that have a texture assigned to them already. With clear before loading, if you load via the load texture sets pop-up, then it's going to clear all of them and then replace them. And below that, you have the option to basically manually enter strings, names, parts of file names that are being used to detect what kind of map you're actually loading. So if it sees a map that has like underscore color, color, diffuse, or albedo in it, then it will assign that to the color channel in the texture set here, and so forth. The slots here that are available for the individual textures depend on the texture workflow that you're using. For PBR textures, there's essentially 2 different ones. There's a metallic and a specular workflow. The thing is, Lightwave natively only supports a metallic workflow, so that's going to be the default. But you can also load texture sets for a specular workflow. Just don't expect it to work with the vanilla principled shader. You will have to build your own shading network there, but it is going to be supported as a texture set. So a metallic texture set contains of a color texture, which you can add here. If you have an occlusion texture as well, you can determine if the color is supposed to be multiplied by the occlusion, and you can just enter a value here if there is an occlusion texture. This is where you have a metallic texture, roughness texture, which you can also invert. Occlusion would be for an ambient occlusion type texture. Luminous texture is something that's being added on top that's self-emitting. Then you have a normal map, which actually doesn't work as of now because I haven't developed that yet. And you can add a displacement map, which you can also invert, and you can the displacement map itself also creates a bump map. So you can either hook up a bump map like I did here, or you can take the displacement output and input that to the where is it? Come on, to the surface displacement input if you prefer to use that. So you have the option of either a bump or a displacement output if a displacement map has been defined. When the normal map, when I would have written the code for that, then you will be able to use the normal map as well. So yeah, that's the metallic workflow. The specular workflow is almost the same, except that the metallic and the roughness images get replaced by a specular and a glossiness image. And yeah, those you can't really use directly with the principal BSDF shader, but you can still use them. Also, because they are different slots, if you switch between those two, it doesn't really, you don't lose any settings or anything, or eventually won't, because currently this actually doesn't even load and save. But yeah, that's essentially the current state of things. Initially, the idea was to actually start with a user interface that's closer to the multi-image sampler, where you would have a number of slots down here of images and a preview up there and settings underneath it. But yeah, in the past week, I kind of iterated that design so often that I eventually ended up with something like this, because this has the huge advantage that you actually get to see all the images in one go. And don't have to tab through anything or click on something to switch from one image to the next one. You will just see the whole shebang, your whole texture set in one panel. And I think that's one thing that is really going to help here. And just to show you what kind of a difference that makes, I've actually downloaded this scene, which was is a part of the GLTF samples, the OpenGL standard. And if you've been on Discord, you've seen this already. Just there we go. Turn on PBR. So this is basically a single UV map mesh with a metallic set of PBR textures on it. And if you load this in using the normal image loaders, you will end up with something. Let me just delete this. That looks like this. That's essentially the closest I could get. And yeah, the normal map here doesn't work either because I didn't find a matching node for that. But yeah, this is essentially what you have to do to make this work. Now, this is a bit of a special case since this is actually designed for real time. If you look at the metal roughness map, it's actually a single map that contains both the metalness and the roughness encoded into the green and the blue channel of that image. Now, this is standardized, but that also means that if you're using the native image loaders, that you will have to use a channel, in this case a channel blender, to split up the two separate color channels and use them differently. So basically, if I zoom in a bit, you will see that the color image is being multiplied by the ambient occlusion image. That's what this does, and then goes into the color of the surface. Then the metal roughness image texture is split up using the channel blender, and the Y channel, which is green, is the roughness, and the Z channel, which is blue, is the metallicness or metallic of that surface. And I also have an emission texture, which gives you some of the self-illuminating things on the helmet, the HUDs, that just goes straight into luminous color. So yeah, this is essentially the kind of stuff that you have to set up every single time that you want to use this kind of texture set in layout or in Lightwave. Now, if we replace this with the new node, let me just add that, the texture set. All right. I'm going to load the textures. And I've got them up here. It's the albedo, ambient occlusion, emissive metal roughness, and the normal map. Unfortunately, there's no displacement map here, otherwise I could use that. Open it. They're loaded already, so it shouldn't take too long. All right, and they're being assigned. So color is being set to the default albedo JPEG. And one thing that is special here, you can see that the metallic channel and the roughness channel both use the same image texture, which is the metal roughness JPEG, but they display something different. And that's because the preview here actually only shows the channel that is being used for metallic and roughness, which would be green and blue in this case. So you don't actually get to see the RGB image here, but you get to see the extracted metallicness and roughness. The same is true for ambient occlusion, which in some texture sets can be encoded in the alpha, and that's for specular texture sets. So that is, yeah, that basically gives you an idea of what's happening here. We have the luminous and we have the normal. All right, so all you have to do then is essentially just, oops, sorry, is just hook it up. And to make things a bit easier, I'll just create a new principled shader, a principled material, and hook it up to this one. And I want the color to the color, metallic to metallic, roughness goes into roughness. And I'm actually not using occlusion directly. Actually, yeah, I haven't set this up yet. And luminous color exactly goes into luminous color. Here we go. I don't have a bump because I would need a displacement for that, and the normal doesn't work yet, so I'm not going to set that one up. And if I replace the hand manually created texture setup with this one, you will notice that it's almost exactly the same, except for the fact that I need to set the luminosity to 100%. And also the ambient occlusion isn't multiplied in, but that's because this setting here doesn't actually work yet, but eventually it will be. And if we just switch back to the manually created one, you will see that it's not completely identical due to the missing ambient occlusion, but it's almost the same and eventually will be the same. And the difference in setup is essentially this compared to this. And this also just gives you a single overview of everything that's used in the setup. So yeah, that is pretty much all I can show right now. There's, as I mentioned, some things that isn't working quite as it should yet. The normal maps don't work because they require a different kind of mapping or more a trickier kind of mapping. Many of these options don't do anything. You will be able to, as I said, multiply the ambient occlusion into the color map up here. And this should actually be enabled. I don't know why it isn't. You will be able to invert the XYZ on the normal map. If you have a bump map, you will be able to change the, or displacement map, sorry. You will be able to change the size of the displacement and invert it. The same for a roughness, which can be inverted as well, just if you want a different look. And also, I don't actually have a bump strength option here, because that is something you have in the principled BSDF shader anyways. So if you hook up the bump, then you have a bump height percentage down here, which controls it. So yeah, I don't really have that setting in here. Yeah, also one thing to note, yeah, this is of course only going to work with the native renderer. Because Octane doesn't know anything about the stuff that's happening inside this node. But the general idea is just to be able to take any kind of PBR texture set that you find on the internet, especially if it's a metallic workflow. Just load those in, hook them up to the shader, and you're done. And if you want to reuse them, just save a preset and then just load them into other scenes. and leave further editing if you really want to tweak them more. Most of that is not going to be done within that node, but between on the connection between the node and the shader. Yes, I mentioned triplanar already. Triplanar would be something that's available here. So you'll get the triplanar options that the triplanar mapping has, and that will allow you to use some of the more generic PBR texture sets out there, and just apply them to a mesh, and that would be really useful for like mass texturing something in a way that looks decent, but where you don't really need all the detail. One website I've been looking at a lot is, just see if I can find them. Yeah, CC0 textures, and yeah, they have a bunch of really nice texture assets, and you will be able to use any one of them. I think, yeah, one of these metal textures is one that I use as a sample. So you can just browse through these, take something you want, something you like, and then just apply it to your textures or to your surfaces. And they all come, I think they all use the metalness workflow. So yeah, you'll be able to use any of these. Any details on the presets? The presets are probably going to use the preset system that all of our plugins use, which doesn't have any previews. But I might look at using the native preset system. The problem with that is I can't really render a preview sphere or something like that. Even here in the node itself, just zoom in a bit. As you see, it doesn't really have any image that's being rendered. One thing I could do is just basically like these do, just render a thumbnail of the color map and ignore all the other ones, which is very likely to be the thing that I will do. But if you actually save a preset with a thumbnail, the thumbnail wouldn't be anything else but the color image map, and it wouldn't be a rendered sphere or ball or something. Not sure how helpful that would be, so I might just use our own preset system, and then you just have to basically organize things yourselves with proper naming and everything. How about a PBR pass-through with an alpha input? Create your own node type to pass data from one to another PBR set. Tricky. So if I understood that correctly, then the idea is to basically say, okay, let's create a custom connection type between nodes, which is essentially all of these outputs here, everything that is required for the PBR texture set to be used, lumped together in one output, and that can be passed as one connection to other nodes that understand it, which would at most be another PBR texture set node, and then you would have the option of blending from one to another. I'm not quite sure how useful that is, especially if you think about how the PBR texture sets kind of work. I mean, if you're losing like half the metallicness of a surface, because you're blending between, let's say, I don't know, a metal and concrete tiles, and all of a sudden you're dropping the metallicness to 50%, then it's not neither going to be concrete nor is it going to be metallic surface. So I think that that probably doesn't actually make that much sense with PBR textures, and should probably be applied to the materials that have the textures applied to them, as opposed to the textures that define how the material reacts. And I also suspect it's going to be something that people are going to use so rarely that, yeah. I mean, granted, if I mean, even if you use it like if you have like two different materials on a single surface, then you're also not going to blend the texture sets, but you're going to blend the materials. And if you want something that's like, 30, 40% one thing and 60, 70% the other thing, yeah, I'm not sure if that is actually the correct way to go about it. Because you can still do the same thing with the materials. And internally, it's not like the shading, you're not losing much performance either, because the shading doesn't happen within the BSDF nodes, but it happens uh, essentially after the surface node. This is just inputs for the actual shading engine and ray tracing, which doesn't happen in the node tree anymore. So it's just a different position on where to tweak the inputs for the material shading engine. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's actually worth the effort, especially given that we still have triplanar mapping to do and normal mapping to suss out and a few other things in there. And I still don't know why these are disabled because they shouldn't be, but yeah, whatever, the controls here. Um, so yeah, that is the current state. I didn't do anything with the speculars yet because these also have very specific color channels assigned to them. Specular itself is RGB. Glossiness is just a scalar value, which is actually wrong here in the node because this one should be green. And there's different encoding methods if you're using looking at real-time assets. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about this. One thing that was certainly interesting was just the evolution of uh, the user interface design from the other image-based plugins to this one. But I think it actually starts to make a little sense like this. Well, and you kind of have the multi-mixer as well, that's true. You just have to connect it, which is a pain, but should be fairly easy to set up. So yeah, any questions? Any suggestions? Also, one thing I did want to do is one thing I found is that these preview thumbnails are just a bit tiny, but there's only so much screen estate I have. Of course, this is scaled up because I'm trying to show you guys the user interface on the stream. So this is like 150% of the normal Lightwave user interface size. But the problem is that I have a horizontal limitation of how wide those thumbnails can be. The vertical height isn't that much of an issue, but the horizontal is. And if I made them any wider, as you can see here, I'd have to start cutting off some of the text and maybe not just call this roughness, but just rough. And so one thing I wanted to do to counter that is the ability to double click on the thumbnail and open the image editor with that image, which I tried today until I found out that yes, I can open the image editor, but I cannot tell it which image to actually display, unlike the native image nodes, which can do that. But I didn't find anything related in the SDK nor in scripting. So this actually might work. No, this doesn't work either. But yeah, that's something I can't do much about. I might be able to just add, double click on an image and it opens the image editor. Let me just fake it like this, but it could just open any image, not necessarily the one that you're working on. Also, one thing I'm certainly thinking about is setting the color spaces properly for the images. At least with a metallic workflow, only the color and the luminous image actually have a color profile applied to them, usually as RGB. Everything else is linear. And when you load an image, at least when the image doesn't exist in Lightwave already in the current scene, then it should also set the color space correctly. If that is something I can do as a plugin, I'm not quite sure. You don't actually choose which channel it's unpacking because there's defaults for that, or there's standards for that. And if people end up finding some that are swizzled around, then I can add options. But right now I'm using the only version that I've ever encountered, which is the one that GLTF is using and a couple of other gaming real-time related standards. But I think GLTF is kind of setting the standard there as well on how those maps are used. All right, John. Most useful to make when click to apply source, for instance, if from Texture Haven use this arrangement, if from Polygon, then use this other mapping. So basically, you are saying that you would like to have a different configuration for different sources. The red channel is ambient occlusion for metallicness, because that's just a scalar value as well. Um, hmm. Well, okay. I mean, currently the setup assumes that you manage to have all the channel names in one setting. That setting is also going to be shared in the Lightwave config, so you don't have to change that anytime you want to, and you can change this. This already works, so I can add, although this doesn't do much. So so this allows you to kind of put all the stuff in there that would work on all the assets or the sources that you use. Another option might be to say, okay, I've got a very special naming convention, and I want that naming convention to have its own settings, and then it would also have its own entry here, which doesn't say load textures, but says, let me just check what you wrote, load texture haven images. Tricky. I'm not sure if that is actually necessary, if the texture names are that different. And it does allow, I'm not sure if that's actually visible here, it does allow for different names to look for within a texture. So, for example, if you look at the color texture, that can either contain an underscore color, spelled the proper way, or an underscore color without the U, or an underscore diffuse, or an underscore albedo. Any of those four, if any of those four match the texture name, then it's going to be used as a color texture. And the same for all the others. So you can actually, like for the emission, it can be either called underscore emission or underscore emissive. And if you have somebody who, I don't know, has some weird shortcuts in their file names, it could also be something like underscore EMS. And all of these would be sufficient to detect the file. One thing I might add, and that would change how all of these patterns look, is add wildcards to it. So let's take the normal. Normal is a bad idea. Actually, no, normal is a good idea. If this would support wildcards, and that's something I can add easily, I could have something like star underscore norm. So any image file that starts with something and then ends with underscore norm dot jpeg dot png whatever, but where underscore norm is the end of it, would be detected by that. Now if the file name is metal texture underscore normal, then that wouldn't be detected this way. Then you would have to add something like underscore normal, for example, and that would then be detected as another option. That would allow you the whole thing to be more finely grained and more finely tuned, but would also make writing these patterns to search for trickier. I mean, so in this case, if something is called, this is my favorite surface underscore metallic underscore version 1, then it's actually going to be detected. If you use a wildcard with a star in front of that, it wouldn't be. So, yeah. Yeah, you can edit those. That's why they're here. Absolutely. That's why it's called configure. And you can edit those and write those. And yeah, and if you find an underscore diff, for example, I actually added the underscores in here. It actually doesn't matter if you capitalize or not, because it's all going to be changed to underscores internally anyways. The reason why I use the underscore thing is because all the textures I have actually all have an underscore before the component name. And also because my first set of test images was actually called metal tiles underscore color roughness normal blah blah blah. The problem is that if it's called metal tiles underscore metallic and I look for the metallic texture name just by looking for the existence of metal within the file name, then it would actually take all of them because the base name was metal tiles. And so yeah, you have to be kind of careful on uh, what you name the sets here, or what text you use here to find the right file names. And that's precisely why I asked on Discord for PBR texture sets, just to see what kind of naming conventions people use. And if my current method is sufficient, because this is the most simple method, or if I need to actually up the game and then add wildcard support and stuff like that. And the question in this case is not if I want to add it or not, because I've got code for that, which makes it very easy to add. The question is if I want to add increase the complexity of this whole panel by introducing wildcards, because that will eventually make it harder for you guys to actually add stuff that works the way you want it to work. A config for a setup. Wow. So basically a setup preset. Hmm. Hmm. You know what? Um, what if it's not actually a config preset? But if you had the option to basically have different, let's call them banks for all of these strings, and you could basically add another one, and the one that's currently selected here is the one that you're currently using. So you could basically set up your banks here for Texture Haven, and you would essentially have something like this pop up here. where you could either add a new bank or delete the current one and whatever, maybe add a default one. But where you could just switch between different presets that you have, different configs that you have created using a pop-up. And the currently selected pop-up is the one that you're actually using when you're loading. Well, named for whatever, because you'll be able to enter whatever name you want to. You will still need to set them up, of course, for your sources or for however your files are named. But just like a preset, they can be named and renamed and whatever. So that should work, and it wouldn't be that tricky to do either. Yeah, I'll look into that. It's probably easier than trying to have a one size fits all configuration for the naming. So basically naming banks or configs. All right, yeah. So yeah, that's all there is. So unfortunately, no double click to view an image. Actually, one thing I could actually add, I think, if I remember the SDK correctly, it should be possible, is double click on an image and view that in an image viewer. So basically, yeah, this is, sorry, it's open at the other display, but basically double click and you get this. I think that's something that would make sense. If I can't go to the image viewer from this, but I can at least view this as a large image in the current, no, if I can't go to the image editor from this, but at least open the image in the image viewer, that would probably be at least something to make the texture workflows better. So yeah, I'll just write that down as well. Double click image viewer. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it and all I have to say for now, as far as I can remember. So, if there's no more questions, then I would like to thank all of you for showing up, even though it is Friday the 13th. I hope you like the way that this is going if you are a patron. If you are not a patron, then move over to patreon.com/dbw right away and become one. And you'll also get access to our Discord channel where I'll be posting updates, often like multiple screenshots per day on the current progress and the current ideas that we have. And yeah, become a patron today, and if not today, then tomorrow. Thanks to all of our existing patrons for supporting us, many of which have supported us for 2 years now. So there's an extra special thank you to all of you. And thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening to me waffling on. Stay healthy, stay safe, and yeah, we'll see you around. Take care. Bye bye.